All right, well, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today for the second webinar in our series discussing the impact of the COVID-19 global pandemic. My name is Kevin Hecht with the Columbia Institute, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. As we discussed in our first webinar, we're in very uncertain times. We're all in unfamiliar territory, dealing with forces we have not experienced before. The situation is fluid, and it can be difficult to keep up with all the information being thrown at us. But even with all the disruptions we're experiencing, life does go on, and the same is true for the real estate economy. One of the challenges we face as appraisers is how do we continue to deliver quality products and services without jeopardizing the health and wellness of ourselves or the other parties involved. As appraisers, we also have questions about our liability when it comes to the pandemic, not only from an analysis standpoint, but also from a personal standpoint. This webinar will address some of these concerns. Before I get started, I have a couple of quick housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being presented live. Our speakers are all coming to us virtually from individual work from home locations, so please bear with us if there are any glitches like weak Wi-Fi or interruptions like dogs barking or children playing. I know everyone's experienced some of those moments over the last couple of weeks. This webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be made available on the Columbia Institute website. We also have a Q&A segment planned at the end of the webinar, so please submit your questions by using the Q&A button in your Zoom screen. Make sure to use the Q&A and not the chat so we can keep all the questions anonymous. I do want to thank all of you that's pre-submitted questions and helped us to identify the information you wanted covered and the panelists you wanted to hear from the most. Now, with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce today's panel of experts. We're very excited to have Peter Christensen of the Christensen Law Firm with us today. Peter's law practice is focused on real estate valuation and related services. His clients include appraisal and valuation firms, appraisal management companies, individual professionals, as well as individual and commercial users of valuation services. Peter's going to discuss some of the legal ramifications of the pandemic and how to keep yourself protected. We also have Jay Schaefer from CoreLogic a la mode with us today. Jay is going to discuss how to use open communication and technology to ensure your physical safety. And our final speaker today is Heather Sullivan, Senior Leader of the Columbia Institute. Heather's an experienced appraiser and appraisal reviewer who's going to discuss the data that you should be looking at to determine if adjustments should be made in your area for a potentially declining market. So without further delay, let's get started. So Peter, thanks again for joining us, and I'll turn the presentation over to you to kick us off.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. Good morning. So I'm Peter Christensen. I'm sitting here in Santa Barbara, California, and that's a beautiful virtual background of Santa Barbara behind me. That's not actually the view out my workshop window here. So Heather, if we could move to the next slide here. Okay, I'm going to cover some issues relating to legal risk for appraisers that relate to COVID, but also share some general lessons this morning. So I will be covering the main potential liability impacts that lawyers or E&O insurers see for appraisers that might stem from COVID-19. And I'm going to share some concerns about future liability in relation to appraisal work generally. And again, with offering some broader lessons along the way here. And then I will share with you some examples of suggested language that you might consider including in appraisal reports in this time. And then throughout the 20 minutes I'll spend with you, though, I'm going to be emphasizing really the importance of using plain English in your reports to really explain specific issues or conditions that are affecting your appraisal. Because that's really, when we talk about liability, that's really the best way to prevent liability. So Heather, so let's start with a frequent issue that I'm asked about as a lawyer quite often by appraisers, even by AMCs, and even by some lenders. I'm asked questions like this quite a bit. And the question really it stems from potential liability for actually making people sick or for other people making an appraiser sick. So an appraiser recently reported to me that she was doing a residential appraisal assignment, and she was on her way inside to go inside a home for this particular inspection. And maybe rudely, maybe sadly, as she was entering that threshold and entering the home, the borrower actually threatened her, "If you make me sick, I'll sue you." Well, that was a new one. That was the first time I heard that. That was early in the crisis. And of course, I've heard other things like, if this appraisal doesn't come in high enough, I'll sue you. So I'll bet this borrower might have had that in the back of his or her mind as well. But this one was, "If you make me sick, I'll sue you." But then, of course, there's also the converse of that. And the converse would be, well, what if that homeowner made the appraiser sick with COVID? Could the appraiser sue that homeowner for making them sick? I mean, these are kind of interesting legal questions, and lawyers are definitely talking about them. Uh, but in this instance, I'll tell you, if we could have the next slide, Heather, uh, that while such claims might be plausible legally, they might be plausible, I can see as a lawyer. And again, I'm talking about kind of these individual claims where, you know, a homeowner is accused of making an appraiser sick and vice versa. I'm not talking about a workplace. A workplace is much different. A large employer, think of those meat processing plants in South Dakota that are having the big problems. Now, that's a totally different kind of liability here. I'm talking about, you know, individual kind of one-on-one situations. But even in these one-on-one situations, this kind of liability, it might be plausible if you have really compelling facts. But as a lawyer, I would see those facts are very unlikely to exist. Now, what would the claim be? The predominant claim would be for some form of negligence. So, I mean, you could have a intentional claim, an intentional fraud or an assault battery type claim, if a person knows that they are sick and then is venturing out and putting other people at high risk. So if you know you're sick, I mean, that's one thing. But the more likely scenario is some form of negligence. The homeowner didn't know they were sick. The appraiser didn't know that they had the virus, but they weren't capable of transmitting the virus yet. So the claim would be some form of negligence then. But the problem is or maybe the good news is that in the when you have a negligence claim, you have to show that that person violated some kind of duty, so that that's why if you don't actually know that you're capable of transmitting the virus, you're not. It would be hard to say that you're actually violating a duty because you don't know what the duty is. You don't know that you have it, so you can't be really violating common sense at that point. But more than that, the bigger problem for these kinds of claims would be what lawyers call causation. That most claimants would find it very difficult to establish that a specific person, even a homeowner who turned out later to be sick, was specifically responsible for infecting them. And the reason, of course, is that there's this vast array of exposures to COVID out there in the communities that we're in. Who's to say you didn't get it at the market, or who's to say you didn't get it at the ATM or the gas station? So that because there's this vast array of community exposures out there, it would be very difficult to pin causation on a specific person. So what I'm saying is the claims are plausible, but probably would be very, very difficult to actually prove. The next slide, please. But nevertheless, I'm sitting here in California, and in California, the California Association of Realtors is concerned enough about this kind of liability that they've actually developed a special form for it, for agents and brokers to use when they are selling a home and listing a home, there's actually a form in California, and a few other state associations of realtors have come out with similar forms. And what the form, the agent or broker has the property owner, property seller sign this form, and then they try to get any other visitors to the property to sign the form. And so that would be maybe a home inspector if the home is being sold, a prospective purchaser who might see that home, or even an appraiser. I've had appraisers asked to sign this form. And what this form does is it puts everybody on notice about the danger of COVID, and then it would make it very, very difficult for anyone who ventures inside that home to later sue, say, the property seller or, of course, the agent or broker for giving them COVID. So these liability issues are enough of a concern that some state real estate associations have come out with forms like this. Now, the California form, it's called the PEAD, for Property Entry Advisory and Declaration. Now, if you're asked to sign one of those as an appraiser, I don't really have any reservations for when appraisers are asked to sign this particular form. And the reason is because it doesn't cause any more liability for an appraiser to sign this particular form. But in other states, I would want you to read the forms that you might be asked to sign, and do be watchful for indemnification language in such forms. So that would be where, okay, you're actually promising to pay other people's legal bills if you transmit COVID, or if they are sued by a third party because someone alleged you transmitted COVID. So be watchful for other forms. Again, I'm not uncomfortable with the California Association of Realtors forms and similar forms like that, but I have seen some bad forms even put out by lenders or banks themselves. And then say you're asked to sign a form like this. What you might do is ask that agent or broker to maybe give you copies of the other forms that the other parties in the transaction have signed, so that property seller or even the broker themselves, because having that form kind of in your work file in the crazy remote event that something should happen might actually help you. So Heather, the next slide, please. So just looking a little bit more closely at this California Association of Realtors form, here's an example of what it says. You understand that showing and visiting properties may be dangerous or unsafe and could expose you or others to coronavirus or COVID-19. So that it's more of an advisory form than any kind of acceptance of liability. And there is even a later form that's been updated by CAR here in California. But again, not too much of a concern. So the next slide, please. But so that really was a remote legal risk that I was talking about. That's not the main risk that I'm concerned about as an attorney for appraisers. What is the more likely legal risk? So the next slide, please. The real risk is because of the COVID-19 crisis. What we're seeing is really something that's like a replay of 2007 to 2009 in the financial crisis then. But it's all these economic issues are really happening in fast forward. And I was doing the same thing back then in 2007 that I'm doing now. I'm defending appraisers, working for appraisal firms, working even for AMCs. And back then, what we saw was because of the financial conditions, because of increased mortgage defaults, because of monetary losses, because of unemployment, because of disruptions in lending, what happened, and also price declines in that crisis, what happened was those economic conditions caused an increase in claims against appraisers. That's what happens when you have a downturn in economic conditions like this. Claims against appraisers go up. Now, and who files these claims most frequently in a time of financial crisis? It's about half and half between lenders, mortgage investors, those type of financial institutions, and borrowers or property purchasers. It's really about half and half of those parties as far as who sues appraisers when we have increased mortgage defaults and economic crises. So let me talk to you about some suggestions on what appraisers might consider doing going forward here. So I do have some suggestions for language in appraisal reports. First, I want to be clear that I can safely predict that no appraisers, there's not going to be an appraiser out there who's going to be sued because they didn't have some special magic COVID-19 specific language in their reports. You don't have to have a page describing what is going on with the coronavirus, how the World Health Organization or how the Centers for Disease Control are handling the virus. There's no need for a big narrative on that. Nobody's going to get sued because they don't have something like that. The real world claims, again, are really would relate to an increase in mortgage defaults. So whether it's borrowers or lenders, they will simply allege that appraisers made mistakes in their appraisals, overstated the value of a property, negligently otherwise. This is just what happens during a financial downturn. And so the most important thing that you need to be concerned about as an appraiser going forward in this COVID crisis is really getting your valuation right. So the question is, how are values being affected in the area of that property by the crisis? Is there a price decline going on? You need to be ready to spot that. Is it stable? Okay, have backup for that. Now, in the short term, we're still really early in the financial effects of the COVID crisis, but in the short term, if you're not seeing measurable effects, or if the effects aren't measurable, just not known, basically, well, you might consider a short statement, including one in your appraisal reports about COVID-19 and market conditions. Now, I do want to be clear that maybe we're getting a little too deep into the situation to still say that the effects aren't measurable, but still, if the data is not sufficient for you to form like something measurable about a price impact in the current crisis, you might consider language like this, that's at the bottom of the screen here. This appraisal was performed following public awareness that COVID-19 was affecting residents in the United States. At the time of the appraisal, COVID-19 was beginning to have widespread health and economic impacts. The effects of COVID-19 on the real estate market in the area of the subject property were not yet measurable based on reliable data. The analyses and value opinion in this appraisal are based on the data available to the appraiser at the time of the assignment and apply only as of the effective date indicated. No analyses or opinions contained in this appraisal should be construed as predictions of future market conditions or value. Okay, that's for early in the crisis. So the next slide, please. But the main lesson that I want to give you that really carries over from the Great Recession and the high volume of claims that followed it is really where do appraisers get sued when they fail to observe and report on actual market impacts as they become measurable? And it's that failure that will really underpin the most likely future legal claims that we see in relation to COVID. So some further suggestions on language for your reports. What about you're one of these appraisers doing a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac related appraisal, and you've been offered these new flexible ways of reporting appraisals that lenders will sometimes order or AMCs will sometimes order. Often these new flexible ways of reporting appraisals from the GSEs don't have an interior inspection by the appraiser, and sometimes they're solely a desktop. As I said, half of claims against appraisers come from borrowers. So keeping that in mind, that that's the source of a majority of the claims, it's important really to restate the obvious here, and plain English is the key. So if you're preparing a desktop or an exterior only appraisal, it's important to really restate the obvious within the report. And that would be something like the appraiser did not perform a visual inspection of the interior or exterior of the subject property, or in the case of a different type of appraisal, that the appraiser performed a personal visual inspection of the exterior of the subject property from the street and did not conduct any interior visual inspection of the subject property whatsoever. I know that the rest of the form in the fixed printed language is going to be saying something like that, but it's your own language in plain English. That's really the key to avoiding liability for things like borrower purchaser claims, restating the obvious. And I can tell you this very important lesson from the Great Recession, that when an appraiser had a legal claim, judges or juries would always give much more import to what an appraiser wrote in plain English in the report than all the fine print, than all the certifications and limiting conditions that are pre-printed in that report form. It's what you write in plain English that matters the most. So some further suggestions: if you are relying on photos, say taken by third parties, or other information supplied by third parties, maybe a party is providing you even a sketch of the interior of the home, something like that, or taking photos, videos of the inside of the home, again, use plain English. And here's an example. In performing this assignment, due to conditions stemming from COVID-19 and in accordance with guidance received from the lender client, I did not make a personal inspection of the interior of the subject property. I've used photos and information from, and then you describe that in plain English, what it is and who supplied it. For the purpose of this appraisal, the appraiser assumes the information supplied from these sources is accurate. So now a question I get a lot is, and this is from appraisers who are really in tune with USPAP and all of the requirements of USPAP, and they want to know, do I have to use an extraordinary assumption to protect myself from liability? Well, there's a little twist here, because if you look in the GSE guidance, the guidance from Fannie and Freddie about extraordinary assumptions and their guidance on these flexible forms of reporting, the GSE states you can't use an extraordinary assumption. They don't want you to use one. But is that dangerous? And my answer is no. No. Whether an appraiser has used an extraordinary assumption or not, that concept of identifying, like, that you're assuming certain information is true, and then you're stating, as USPAP requires, that the assignment results may differ if the information turns out not to be true. Whether an appraiser has done that, taken that step, based on, I can say, 8,200 claims that I've had a chance to study, based on that claims experience, the reality is that this distinction in USPAP has never made a discernible difference in real-world lawsuits. The far more valuable protection is for the appraiser to explain in plain English what information from third parties they are relying on. And that's much more important than whether that amounts to a general or extraordinary assumption. It's just that extraordinary assumption concept has not proven relevant in liability claims. Next slide, please, Heather. So some further suggestions on language for reports. Really explain in that report what you did and make sure that you have that support in the work file. This isn't going into a financial crisis like we perhaps are, or we already are in. It's really not the time to rely on just canned phrases or vague language. Just saying things like, I reviewed existing public and private sources, is not sufficient. You really should spell out the facts, information, and details in plain English. I think I've said plain English too many times today. I'll try not to say it again. And supplement those work files with good notes. So what were you asked to do? Take some notes, put it in the work file. What special discussions did you have with the client? A few lines of notes, put it in the work file. Remember that claims against appraisers are rarely made just within weeks or months after a report completed. Claims about mortgage appraisals tend to happen years later. And that's when you need your work file to provide this kind of extra support and defense for your appraisal. The next slide. Yep. So now again, if you are preparing residential appraisals under these various new guidelines from Fannie and Freddie or other flexible report options, you might also explain something similar. And this is, again, it's restating the obvious, trying to take care of borrower type claims. Because of the impacts of COVID-19, the appraiser has been requested to report this appraisal on a pre-printed form that was contemplated for a different scope of work by the appraiser that may normally have included a personal inspection by the appraiser of the property. Accordingly, this appraisal report, particularly the pre-printed information concerning the appraiser's scope of work, limiting conditions and certifications, should be read in the context of the changes requested and the modified language and text adopted in response to the impacts of COVID-19. So what we're saying is this new flexible report that I've done, it might be a little confusing to the reader because we have the pre-printed language, but then I've included a new version of the pre-printed language, and I'm telling the reader to be wary of that. The next slide, please. Now, the 50% of the threat to appraisers comes from borrowers and purchasers. How do you deal with that? Whatever kind of appraisal report you're doing. This is whether you're commercial, residential, what is the most effective thing you can do? The most effective thing you can do, aside from getting your valuation just right, the most effective thing you can do against a borrower or purchaser type claim is include a clarification at the back of the report where you might have your other clarification about the appraiser's not a home inspector, that kind of thing. But if you state something like this, the appraiser has not identified any purchaser, borrower, or seller as an intended user of this appraisal, and such parties should not rely on the appraisal for their own purposes. Neither payment for the appraisal nor a receipt of a copy of the appraisal by such a party or any other third party means that the party is an intended user. Such parties are advised to obtain an appraisal from an appraiser of their own choosing if they require an appraisal for their own use. This appraisal report should not serve as the basis for any property purchase decision or any appraisal contingency in a purchase agreement relating to the property. Now, in a long presentation, and sometimes I do give the 7-hour versions of this, I explain all the intricacies there and why that language is so important. But basically what it does is it makes it much more difficult for a borrower or property purchaser to sue you over an appraisal that you'd created for the lender, for the lender's use. It makes it much more difficult to them based on the case law out there of defending hundreds and hundreds of appraisers. So I wish you good luck. That's the end of my presentation.
Peter, thank you very much. And that's some great information. And I know that appraisers especially appreciate the specific examples, but I will say that I don't think you can say plain English enough to appraisers. I think that's one of the things that certainly we can learn from and adopt in our appraisals as we go through this pandemic and even beyond that. So thanks again for all of that. There are a couple of questions that came up during your talk, but if it's all right, we'll get back to those towards the end of the presentation if you can hang around for just a little bit.
All right, thank you, Kevin.
Right. For our next topic, we have Jay Schaefer from Alamode, and Jay is CoreLogic's Senior Executive of Valuation Technology Solutions. In this role, he's responsible for software solutions and services for collateral valuations. Before CoreLogic, Jay served as the Chief Executive Officer of Alamode. And so, Jay, I will turn it over to you to provide some tips that can help ensure physical safety as we continue to deal with the COVID virus.
Thanks, Kevin. Happy Tuesday, everyone. I'm honored and thankful to be here with you, Columbia Institute, Peter, Heather, and all of you joining us on the webinar. Today, I'd like to discuss 2 potential communications an appraiser should be having during the COVID pandemic. Hopefully, it will spawn a few ideas or help refine what you're currently doing. During our time, I'd like to discuss two parts. First is the communication appraisers are having with their clients, and second is with the homeowner/property contact. In the webinar last week, Scott Reuter did a deep dive on the GSE temporary flexibilities, which remain in place for loans with application date on or before June 30th, 2020. If you didn't see that webinar, Columbia Institute has made that recording available. So afterwards, go check it out. As lenders work to understand and implement those flexibilities into the lending practices, they also moved to working from home. This resulted in a lot of appraisal orders being put on hold. We are also hearing about orders on hold at appraisal offices. I was recently talking to an appraiser who averages 700 appraisal orders per month and had over 100 orders on hold. In my conversations with lenders, they talk about thousands of orders being on hold because of COVID. When you look at all lenders and appraisers across the country, there are a lot of orders currently on hold. If you're looking for new business and you understand the GSE flexibilities and you have the technology to perform these appraisals, let your clients know proactively. Tell them you have the technology to have a no contact method of collecting homeowner data, which is allowed under the GSE flexibilities. Explain your process and make them comfortable with your solution. Explain that you'll reach out to the concerned homeowner and let the homeowner know you won't need in their home. Your clients are concerned about their customer experience. Explain to the lender how easy it is for the homeowner to get the information, no application installs, no logins, no account creation, sample photos, and dedicated phone support. Let your client know the technology you're using helps to prevent fraud, using current pictures, time-stamping photos, recording where the photos were taken, homeowner attestations, and etc. Explaining to your client your process, your technology, and your capabilities could get you more work. Now, let's switch over to the communication an appraiser has with the homeowner. I get asked from appraisers what to do when I call the homeowner and they're concerned about coming into the home. I think there are two potentials. The first is to explain the steps and process that you'll take to address their concerns about catching COVID. Homeowners aren't as familiar with the appraisal process as you are. Explain how long you'll be inside the home. Some homeowners think the appraisal will take as long as an inspection. Let them know you have no symptoms. You'll wear a mask, shoe coverings, gloves, etc. Let them know you will notify them when you're outside and they can open all doors, turn on all lights, and leave the house. Then you'll do the inspection and stay there until they return. For some homeowners, they still won't feel comfortable with anyone in their home. So when they express their concern about you coming into their home, let them know there might be a way for you to do the appraisal without coming into their house. Let them know you'll get right back with them. Then immediately reach out to your client and let them know the homeowner is uncomfortable with you entering the house. Let the lender know you have the technology to perform the appraisal under the GSE guidelines to get the information you need in a no contact method. This is a very similar approach to what we discussed in the opening. If the lender client approves, then have them send you the modified order. Remember, many of the appraisers many of the lenders are dealing with these manually, so you may have to call your client and have this conversation to make sure you don't lose the order. If you don't have the technology to do the no contact methods of collecting data, we built Property Assist to keep appraisers safe and working. You can go to www.alamode.com/propertyassist or call us at 1-800-ALAMODE to learn more. It's an absolute free for Alamode customers. Don't get me wrong, if you don't feel safe, don't do the assignment. And as always, if you don't feel you have the information you need to render a credible value, then decline the assignment. If you take these assignments, make sure you note your report, like Peter previously mentioned. In closing, I hope this helps you appraisers by sharing some communication ideas to earn and keep more business. With that, utmost importance to me is that everyone stay safe, and I wish you good health. Back to you, Kevin.
Thanks for those tips, Jay. I mean, safety has to be a top priority for appraisers, and it's great that we're working on options for appraisers to be able to keep working even in these times. So if you don't mind sticking around, there's a couple questions that have come up, and I'll like to address those with you after we hear from Heather.
Be happy to.
Thanks. So that brings us to our final speaker, Heather Sullivan from the Columbia Institute. And as I mentioned earlier, Heather is senior leader of the Columbia Institute. She's an experienced appraiser and appraisal reviewer, and she's going to talk about the data that you should be looking at to determine if adjustments should be made in your area for a potentially declining market. Heather, floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Kevin. Peter and Jay, that was a lot of great and powerful information you just shared. So thank you both for those incredible insights. I'm going to switch directions just a bit and work with you on when to make a market adjustment and determine how much of an adjustment to make. The question that came up most in our pre-submitted questions was, is COVID-19 impacting the market? And I did switch that question to read more in that, is COVID-19 impacting your market or my market? Unfortunately, I can't answer that question for you. Maybe in your area, it's been greatly impacted, or maybe there hasn't even been a single case in your market and life has sustained a reasonable level of normalcy. Truth be told, it's not that simple. It's not just about what communities have reported cases, or even if it's business as usual in your market. Over time, you'll still see evidence your market is being impacted, and how it is being impacted is going to be your new appraisal problem to solve. While these are devastating times as appraisers, this is also our time to shine as professionals. With so much uncertainty in the future, our role in helping our clients make sound lending decisions is more important than ever. So let's make sure we're ready and be able to provide the most accurate and timely information about our unique markets. I'll spend about 15 minutes covering how to start documenting and analyzing the impacts COVID-19 is having on your market and the marketability in your area. So since every market is different, it's important that we all understand what creates value. This is Economics 101, and it applies to all markets, not just real estate. The reason it's incredibly important that we recognize these forces is because without one of these forces in play, then there is no market. Or if one of these forces changes, then it changes the dynamics of our market. COVID-19 is likely to impact all these forces, but not always in the way that we may think. When thinking about social distancing and restricted travel potentially sticking around through the end of the year or beyond, then we may see shifts in the desires, such as buyers or renters looking for properties with home offices, outdoor open spaces, or eating, kitchen, dining room spaces. However, with high unemployment rates and the repercussions of all these temporary losses of income and late payments, a potential buyer's purchasing power might also diminish, even though interest rates are at an all-time low. On the supply side, you might start seeing a scarcity of inventory, as those that were considering a move are now in a holding pattern as they wait and see what the future holds. In addition, some homeowners may not want buyer traffic coming in and out of their home as they worry about the transmission of COVID-19. So let's talk a little bit about the physical, economic, government, and social forces that can have significant impacts on value. Aside from changes in buyer or renter preferences, the physical characteristics will likely not be as big of a factor as the other forces at play. We will see economic, governmental, and social forces making significant plays in the foreseeable future. Economic impacts will be significant and widespread. This is where unemployment, supply chain disruptions, and many changes in the neighborhood community districts will start playing a role. The government is already active in influencing things significantly through monetary stimulus packages, interest rate reductions, stay-at-home and social distancing orders, essential work restrictions, and so much more. From a social perspective preference, We'll see changes because of COVID-19. Almost immediately, there was a shift in the buyer profile as baby boomers and Gen Xers were like pulling out of the market. A lot of millennials were jumping in. There's a couple forces that could be at play here that we would have to understand and pay attention to in order to measure the impact they're having on the value. All of these forces will determine what's hot and what's not in the coming months, which will directly relate to your market's supply and demand indicators. So what do all these forces at play do? They affect the property's value and marketability. Marketability expresses preferences towards one property over another, while value measures market reaction to a specific property. Since appraisers are responsible for establishing a property's value and marketability, the appraiser will be expected to analyze the unique impact the COVID-19 pandemic is having on the market they serve, both from a value and marketability perspective. So I'm going to go through 3 steps, and this is basically, in a nutshell, what we need to focus on and what actions we need to take. Step 1 is document the timeline. We use historical data to determine a market value as of a more current effective date. When market participants become aware of an adverse event or situation, they tend to immediately start reacting to this information they just learned. This is why the timeline is important to understand for an appraiser to properly assess changes in value and marketability over time, or be able to make a credible market condition adjustment. The challenge with COVID-19 is it's not just one event, but more of a chain reaction of events. In addition, information is limited, fear is widespread, the extent of the impact is uncertain, and the recovery time is unknown at this point. This will cause volatility and fluctuations over time and significant variances between markets. Kirkland, Washington, where I live, and where the first cases of community spread COVID-19 were originally discovered back in late February. Since that time, it's been a whirlwind of economic and governmental events such as school closures, stay-home orders, essential business restrictions, eviction moratoriums, and so much more. So appraisers have had to immediately start investigating the market reaction to each of these events beginning in February. None of these events happened at the same time, and each may have impacted potential buyers and renters differently. So step 2 in the process is to start collecting data and running reports that will help you identify the trends in the market. 3 months from now, when you're going to use a dated sale as a comparable, it's going to be harder to remember what exactly was going on at the time of that sale to properly understand what forces influenced that purchase price. Therefore, start now collecting data from both a micro and a macroeconomic standpoint. Macroeconomics looks at the economy as a whole and analyzes decisions made by states and governments to craft economic and fiscal policy. These decisions typically have a widespread impact that trickles down to the market participants at a local level. Think about how eviction moratorium, stimulus package, stay-at-home owners have changed the landscapes in your market. Microeconomics, on the other hand, is the study of the individual behaviors and business decisions. It's how we gauge supply and demand and other factors that determine price levels. When we get into microeconomics, it's important that we recognize that different market segments will be impacted differently. Therefore, we want to be able to funnel down and only use the data from those comparables that are deemed comparable and competing to the subject. While many appraisers don't find the 1004MC form useful, the underlying premise of this form is sound. The 1004MC was designed to ensure that we focus on the microeconomic data specific to the subject's market segment. If it's these sales and listings that best reflect the subject's true value, marketability, and trends. Therefore, use the 1004MC as a roadmap to performing a proper market trend analysis. So what data should appraisers be collecting at the neighborhood and market segment level to track these changes in the overall time. Listed on the slide are some key market indicators at the micro level to monitor closely and use as the basis of your analysis and adjustments. Much of this information can be collected from your local MLS, which I'll show you some of that in just a minute. But for those indicators listed that can't be pulled from the MLS, look on your local government websites at the city, county, and state levels. They'll have information and data on unemployment and delinquency rates, new housing permits, tax base adjustments. Also look at news articles published by the local media outlets covering stories on different ways COVID-19 is impacting your community. These stories will typically focus on changes in demographics and community makeup, and will also provide some statistical information along the way. So another great resource. Changes in buyers' preferences is the only indicator that is not necessarily easily quantifiable using the raw data. Since this is more qualitative, you'll want to pay special attention to news articles, agent comments, and even surveys of market participants to see how preferences are changing over time. Many times property values are the last thing appraisers see change because of the amount of time it takes to find and acquire a new home. Therefore, in the short run, some of these other indicators may be much more useful. So here's a snapshot of my market. We don't have time to really get into the details, but I did want you to notice that I'm comparing month to month, month by month, and year over year. And this is just the beginning of my in-depth analysis that I would perform. I would also look at the full 24-month spectrum, just didn't have space on this slide. If numbers are staggeringly different from historically similar times, then it's probably a sign that there is a new force at play in the market. This is just the initial study, and over time I'll keep adding more and more information. That's why I said, you know, that it's important to start collecting the data now, because I will have this for the next year, 2 years, 3 years, depending on how long we're still experiencing impacts from this virus. In addition, I'll start looking for resales and match paired sales, which we'll get more into those recognized methods and techniques in just a moment. But here in my market, I think the most glaring change is that the number of active listings is down significantly in a time when the market is supposed to be heating up with activity. So while last year my market was already experiencing a shortage of inventory, this year it's even below those levels. Plus, with everyone in lockdown until the end of May, I'm not thinking that it's going to balance out at this point in time. So I'm sure COVID-19 is impacting my market, but not necessarily in the way I would have predicted had I not had the numbers to tell the story. Before now, I'm just not seeing it in my market. I have to tell you, since I do live within a block of a nursing home that reported those first cases of COVID-19, and just as things were getting crazy, media parked up and down my street, blue ribbons going up around my neighborhood, and people's fears rising as more cases and deaths were mounting, my neighbor just a few houses down decided it was a good time to put their house on the market. And I remember thinking to myself, that property is never going to sell. And to my surprise, that house sold in 3 days at $25,000 over the asking price. And, you know, within a short period of time after that, I had 2 other homes in my subdivision go under contract in mid-March. And after less than a week on the market, both closed in April. One sold at $5,000 over the asking price, and the other sold at $115,000 over the list price. So this is why we don't make judgments or adjustments based off of our gut feelings. Instead, we rely on these market indicators to tell us the story. This sales information, coupled with year-to-date increases in value and slight annual appreciation, as well as marketing times less than 18 days, list to sale price ratios at 100% of the asking price. Tell Me Things may have been stable over the 12-month period, but in the first 4 months of this year, things are heating up again with a rate of appreciation recorded at almost 8% in the just 4 months of 2020. Therefore, it will depend on when my comparable sales went under contract, if I make a time adjustment or not. And this is why a timeline and data representative of the market is so important to the credibility of our conclusions. So everyone wants to know when do I make an adjustment and how do I know what the adjustment should be? COVID-19 doesn't change the appraisal process or the recognized methods and techniques that we use to determine a market condition adjustment. It just may change the readings. So if you perform proper market analysis, the data and trends will tell you when an adjustment is needed, in what direction, and how much. My approach has always been keep applying different methods and techniques until you find an answer to the appraisal problem being solved. There are a number of recognized methods and techniques available to appraisers to analyze these changes over time. To name a few, you could perform a resale, paired sale, group data analysis, review comparative indices, or survey market participants. The equation for finding the rate of change has not changed either. It's just the current value minus the previous value divided by the previous value. This equation will tell you the amount of adjustment that is needed and in which direction, positive or negative, it should be made. This next slide will show you all the areas throughout the report that are interconnected and intended to help us with our market analysis. The subject's listing history and that of the comparable sales, sales analysis, 1004MC, market condition adjustments are all snapshots over time. There is a reason we are asked to analyze this information and summarize our results. It's to provide our clients with an up to a 3-year market trend leading to the effective date of the appraisal. If all the different data points line up with the opinions and conclusions being made by the appraiser, then the client will rest assured that they have received a credible and trustworthy report. That is all the time I have for today, but I did want to leave you with a few final action items. Thank you all for your time today. Kevin, I will hand it back over to you.
All right, thanks, Heather. And that's some great information. And again, one of the things to remember is that this presentation is being recorded. So take some time to revisit that because there's a lot of great stuff in what Heather presented. We are almost at the top of the hour and we've gotten quite a few questions, but there is one particular one, Peter, if you don't mind, I would like to ask you before we finish up here. And that is, how do we know and or protect ourselves when a homeowner uses a video app for the inspection and hides flaws in the home?
Well, if it's one of these, if the appraisal is being done in one of these new flexible formats that are, instructed by Fannie or Freddie, then one thing to note is that the GSEs have actually taken out one of the certifications, and that's certification number 10. And that does help in this respect of this potential liability that a borrower, purchaser, a borrower or an agent provides kind of false information or misleads with the video. Because what that certification normally says is that the appraiser has verified from a disinterested source all info in the report provided by parties with a financial interest in the transaction or the property. And so that certification is removed in some of the new flexible reporting options. So that's a safeguard right there. But then even more critical than that, as I was talking about in my presentation, what you do in plain English is much more important. So describing what you're relying on, describing that the video was supplied by the borrower or the agent, whoever it is, when you do that, that acts like a disclaimer, that plain English. And it really does, really removes almost all the threat of the liability there, because the reader of that report knows what you were relying on. It's not a secret. So that's the key. It's the plain English.
Awesome. I love that explanation. Thank you very much. We are pretty much at the top of the hour, and I know we didn't get to everybody's questions, but we'll be able, or we're going to provide answers to as many questions as we can in a follow-up email. We want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I would like to personally thank all of our panelists for the wealth of information they each shared today. Peter, Jay, Heather, we greatly appreciate your time. Just a reminder, our final webinar in this series will be on Wednesday, May 27th. In this webinar, we'll be looking at the future of the industry and how we come out of this. Dr. Frank Nothaft, Chief Economist at CoreLogic, will join us to provide an overview of the impacts COVID-19 is having on the larger housing market and provide us with an economic forecast. We'll also have Scott Reuter, Chief Appraiser at Freddie Mac, back to discuss the long-term effects COVID-19 is expected to have on the appraiser profession and the mortgage industry. And we're very excited to announce that Lisa Damaris, Vice President of Appraisal Issues for the Appraisal Foundation, will also be joining us to talk about what's going on in Washington, including industry updates and to provide an introduction to the Appraisal Foundation's webpage on COVID-19 related issues. A lot of great topics still to be discussed. So if you haven't registered for that webinar, please head to www.columbiainstitute.net to sign up today. So again, just to wrap a couple things up, any questions that we didn't get to, we'll be following up through an email. A recording of this presentation will be available in a day or two. We'll email a link to all the registered attendees. Please feel free to share that link with anybody that you think might gain something from this webinar. And finally, we know that you're all going through a lot right now. So if there's anything we can do, please know that we're here to help. Thank you again for being here today. Please be safe out there, stay well. Peter, Jay, Heather, thank you again for participating in this webinar. Take care, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.